Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Even Better podcast. This is your host, Sinikka Waugh, and I'm so delighted to welcome you back to another episode of the Even Better podcast. This is part of our ongoing mission here at Your Clear Next Step to help us all have even better work days so that together we can co-create better communities. I am delighted to welcome as our guest today, Benen Witkop. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Sinikka. It's an honor to be here.
Such a joy. So I have had the pleasure of working with Benen for just about a year now. Benen and I met through a mutual connection, and Benen started as an intern with our organization and it moved on as an employee within our organization. And Benen is an aspiring author and screenwriter, and I have had the joy of working side by side with him as a writer. And I know he is an aspiring author and screenwriter with a number of projects underway. So bigger and better things on the horizon for Benen. Recent grad of the University of Iowa, and he has a BA in creative writing and screenwriting. So when we think about Benen's experience as a writer, this can be one of those things that writers spend a fair amount of their time either just nose to the grindstone, writing on their own, overwhelmed with the written word that they're producing, or under the gun of the pressures of what everyone else is telling them to write at this particular moment. And so I think about the experiences that Benen is going to share today in the stories that he's going to bring to the table, and it's fun to have this opportunity to hear from Benen about his experiences as we're going to talk about methods to prevent burnout. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. Benen, anything else that you want to talk about as far as why you picked this particular topic for five methods to prevent burnout? Why is this near and dear to your heart?
Well, Sinikka, like what you said, burnout is something that I personally have had to deal with, and a lot of that has come from my experiences as a writer, specifically during college, which I graduated about a year ago. And the classes that I took, while a lot of them were very well balanced and paced out for just the class themselves, I wasn't only taking one class, I was taking 4 classes, 5 classes, one semester. I even had 6 classes. We'll get more to that later. But even beyond that, in the year that I worked at Your Clear Next Step, I did a lot of writing, and sometimes it started to teeter over into the edge of burnout territory when I would take things that were a little too much. And I actually wrote a blog about this topic for Your Clear Next Step about a month and a half ago, I believe it was, maybe a little more than that. And I did a lot of research into it because when this topic came up as something that we should write about, I immediately jumped on it because I was like, I deal with burnout. I've had to deal with burnout very frequently, actually. It's very common occurrence in my life. And, I learned that in our lifetime, the average adult is going to work about 100,000 hours. That's a lot of hours to work, even when you consider that you're going to stretch that out across 50 or 60 years of your life. That's definitely a lot of time to spend crammed in at a desk, fingers flying over a keyboard or on a construction site or wherever you are. And the reason I bring this up is because statistically speaking, you're probably going to burn out at least once if you have 100,000 hours to do it. And again, even then, it's not even just about, your work, because as you mentioned, I'm an aspiring writer right now. I've never written anything for like a publication beyond a poem that I submitted to a literary magazine when I was in high school. And I'm currently in probably, you could say, in the middle of burnout right now. Writer's block is almost a form of burnout, in my opinion, where you just have so many ideas that just kind of get stuck in your head and you don't know which one you need to move forward with, or you have an absence of ideas because you use so many ideas that you just can't even fathom how you could ever move forward again. And I'm experiencing that on more than one of my creative projects at this exact moment. So yeah, burnout is very much something that I've had to deal with across all of the things that I've been doing from high school to now.
Bad. And so thinking with that number that's sort of horrific, 100,000 hours over the course of our lifetime that will work, that's on average. That average means that some of us are going to work more than that. And while some will work less, a fair that average, yikes, that's a lot of hours. So we've got to plan for it, anticipate it, prevent it if we can, navigate our way through it. And I like, as we were thinking about topics, I liked the idea of coming and visiting with you and hearing your insights on this, because you're not just saying how to deal with burnout when we get here, but you're really talking about how to prevent it, how to do things to maybe prevent it from being so bad when you can see it on the horizon, right? So it's 5 methods to prevent burnout.
Yes, it's not the best way to deal with burnout is to make sure it never happens in the first place. Because once you're there, yes, there are obviously things that we can do, but you're not going to feel good about yourself. You're going to feel exhausted. You're going to be stressed. You're going to be tired. You're not going to want to do anything. And that's really not a mindset that we want, or, most of the time we can afford. A lot of the time, this is going to happen while you're working. And if you're not working, that's not good for you, and it's not good for your employer, and it's not good for anybody.
You bet. So let's dive right in. What are these talking points? I think the first one you had was recognize the symptoms. What does that mean? Take us through that.
Yes. So while I was working on the blog that I wrote a few months ago, one of the things that I discovered in my research was, so there's this company called Asana. It's a work management platform basically that exists on the internet. I didn't look too much into it, but I looked into it far enough to know that they seem to do a lot of these business studies, and they seemed reputable to me. And in 2022, they took a random survey of 10,000 employees across the United States, and they found that of those 10,000, 74% of them reported feeling the symptoms of burnout. So those symptoms clearly are very prevalent. And what that kind of spoke to me is that even before burnout hits us, you're going to notice something. And it's going to be very obvious that either you are burned out or you're well on your way to it. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, if we know what a problem looks like, then that's our best shot of being able to make sure it can stop. It's kind of the same case of when you look at, say, like you look at a broken circuit. If you don't know where the break is, you have no chance of ever fixing that circuit. And that's why I figure that this is like the first step to figuring out how to make sure that burnout doesn't happen, is recognizing the symptoms. And this is going to be kind of a pyramid that we're going to be doing here, where these steps typically build off of each other. And so I find that the first step is to recognize the symptoms. So some of those symptoms, because where would we be without telling you what they are? Burnout can end up making you feel like you're consistently drained, like you're unable to cope with your workload, and outwardly, these are the kind of noticeable behavioral shifts that we would be able to see in ourselves or in our peers and coworkers, whereas you wouldn't really be able to tell those first two so distinctly. You could very easily see sadness, anger, irritability, frustration, or a lack of care. And those are the most prevalent outward symptoms of burnout. And, burnout, while it's obviously got this problem of it prevents us from doing our work, it also can cause like really bad long-term effects, including insomnia, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, even a weakened immune system. So you could get sick way easier with things that aren't even on this list. If you have a weakened immune system, what's going to stop the next cold from coming in and knocking you out? Then you can't do any work at all. Last time I had a cold, I was shacked up in bed for a full day because I just couldn't convince myself to do anything. And I just think that nobody really should need to deal with these. And part of this is that it's not just about recognizing the symptoms. And we have to remember that. It's also that we have to call it out, whether they're in ourselves or in somebody else. We have to call out the problem and call attention to it. Because if we're not working as a team, we're not working, period. And we can't do everything alone. And that's really my outlook on this, is that you gotta make sure that people know that, hey, I'm feeling burned out, or hey, I think you're starting to feel burned out, because then we can take the next steps that we have here to make sure that process doesn't get to that inevitable bad conclusion.
You bet. So you describe this as a pyramid and things layer on top of each other. So that bottom layer, if you will, the first step is the recognizing the symptoms. If we've recognized the symptoms and we've identified and we called it out, what do we do next? What's the second step?
Well, the next step would be you got to learn the methods that you can use to deal with these issues. And that's what kind of these next two steps would be. These two kind of form the next layer of the pyramid, which is learning to refuel and recharge and considering what is important to do right now. And we'll start with the first one. We'll start with refuel and recharge. Breaks are not a bad thing. A lot of times people will say, I just got to get this work done. I just got to power through to the end.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, yes, you got to get your work done. I'm not saying you don't got to get your work done. But take 5 minutes, stand up, do a loop around your cubicle or your office or wherever you are. Go to the water cooler. If you're working remotely, go get a snack, go walk your dog. Just take some time to go clear your head. You could do a task. You could just take some time to just sit on the couch for a few minutes and just think about nothing. The point is, we're not machines. We're not built to just run forever. But even if you think about that analogy, when was the last time you heard of a machine that didn't break after being constantly used with no maintenance? And, like I was thinking about this and I was coming up with some examples and I just used all of the things I happened to be feeling at the time. Our eyes get tired, our bodies get tired, our brains get tired. And I really think that last one is the most important. Mental fatigue is not, there's no joke I could make out of mental fatigue. If your brain is hurting just trying to think about thinking about something, that's not good, because that means that you're going to not want to do these tasks that you have to do, because you're not even going to want to think about trying to do them because you're just that exhausted. And as I mentioned earlier, we're probably working as a team. And if we as an individual can't put our best foot forward to assist our team, then we might drag down the rest of the team. And that can cause delays in the work. That can cause people to need to be, pull back a few steps and make revisions. And then we might not meet a deadline. So if you can just take 15 minutes or 10 minutes or even 5 minutes and just get up and go relax for a few minutes and then come back and tackle your problem again after giving your brain just a little bit of time to reset, then that can prevent 2 hours of revisions that you have to do later in some way.
You said something interesting there, and I'm going to pause for a second because you said refuel and recharge, and I know you've got a story you want to share here, and I want to get back to that. But with refuel and recharge, there's something about the pause. There's something rest for sure. I'm a fan of making sure that we are properly hydrated and like we're eating proper nutrition as well too. Does that fit into this space too? Is that where you would take that, or is that going to come later?
Yes, I would definitely fit that in here. I mentioned earlier getting a snack. Obviously, energy comes from food. So if you're feeling tired, the best thing you can do is go grab a snack. And it should be a healthy snack. It should be a fruit, or obviously a fruit would be better than like a cookie, but a cookie can also work because that'll feed into your energy levels.
Fair enough. Okay, so refuel and recharge. But you were about to move on to a story before I so rudely interrupted.
No problem. I won't go too far into this story as it is pretty personal. But right after I started Your Clear Next Step, I experienced the breakup of my first ever, well, it was my first ever relationship, as well as being my first ever long-term relationship. We had been dating for just under 2 years at that point. And more awkwardly, that was about 2 weeks after we started living together. So it was kind of a mental shock, to say the least. And it had a real negative effect on me. And despite that, I had just started at Your Clear Next Step just a couple of weeks before that, and I didn't want to let you down. And so I was really straining myself to try to make sure that I was still meeting the expectations that had been set of me. But like I said, I just pushing myself to do that while I had all of these other issues in the back of my head, it it didn't work. Because while we're talking about all these things that can happen at work, that can be problems with burnout, that's not the only thing that could be a problem. You have life outside of work. You have your personal relationships, you have your personal finances, you have your personal health. And, we talked about all of those symptoms earlier. Those aren't necessarily work-related symptoms. Type 2 diabetes is gonna hit you hard no matter where you are, at your desk or in your house. So when I experienced this breakup, it was really hard for me to do my work the way that I wanted to do it, and you guys needed me to do it. But at the time, they said, "Hey, you don't need to push it. It's okay to take some time to yourself and make sure that you're healthy, because you're not going to put your best foot forward if you don't even have your best feet." And I didn't have my best feet at that time. I barely had feet to stand on, is what it felt like. So whenever I would feel these negative emotions welling up, I would take some time. I'd get up from my desk and I would go. I was working remotely, and I went and I just went out into the backyard, and it was nice. It was the middle of spring. I was in the South. It was very nice and sunny and felt good. And I just kind of would sit on the edge of the pool or take a walk around the backyard and just collect myself. And then I would come back in, and it significantly improved the quality of my work. Like, noticeably, I was getting work done more efficiently and faster, and the quality was better when I would take some time every hour or so, take 5 or 10 minutes just to go and clear my head and make sure that I was in a position where I could focus on my work and my attention wasn't on something that was just pushing me to burn myself out. Because that was the problem, was I was using my work as an escape, and that's not beneficial to anyone. So the other piece of this pyramid, consider what it is important to do right now. And what that boils down to is prioritization. Don't take on a bunch of extra work, because if you take that break at the end of the day, you're not going to have the energy to get through everything you've set up before then. That's why it's important to take the break now. And, you have to consider the effects that it'll have in the future. So the reason that I bring this up is because not everything has to be done in one day, unless you procrastinate and it all gets pushed to the end of the week or something like that. And that's a whole nother can of worms that we're not going to go into. But when you're talking about prioritization, if you're a writer, say you have a business proposal, you have a blog, and you have a social media caption, and the business proposal has to be done by the end of the day, the blog has to be done by the end of the week, and the social media caption just has to be that can just happen, whenever it happens. Now, that's not obviously what it's going to be every time, but we'll just say that for an example, that's what it is.
Sure.
And realistically, you're looking at these projects that you have, and you say, I could probably get all three of these done in one single day, but I would have to work the entire day to make it happen. And that could be, catastrophic in the end, because if you don't take a break, your business proposal is probably going to be great. Your blog is probably going to be okay. And then your social media caption is probably not going to be very good at all, because you've just spent all of your energy and all of your quality writing motivation on those first two projects. So you look at those and you say, well, this has to be done today. I have, say it's Wednesday, I have 2 or 3 days to finish this blog, and then the social media caption can happen whenever. So I don't even, obviously there's kind of an invisible time limit on that, but it's not something that you're really looking at. So what you would want to do is you'd want to say, okay, well, I know that I have to get the business proposal done today, because this doesn't even take into account if there's unexpected factors that pop up. Like suddenly an edit comes in for the business proposal while you're right in the middle of it, and you have to quickly turn around and redo it. And then if you know that you have to get this blog done today as well, because you convinced yourself that you absolutely have to get all of these things done today, then you're going to be looking at that blog going, oh God, I'm not going to have enough time to do that. I got to do this even faster. And then you're going to have even more problems. So if you do that first, then you take your little break, then you've given yourself the time that you need to recharge so that you can go into your next thing refreshed, recharged, and you don't get the feeling that I have to have all of these things done right now. That's not beneficial to anyone. Your work, is quality is going to suffer, and you're just not going to be feeling well enough.
One of the things I'm fond of saying around here, in fact, I used the line just today, is that we are largely in HR, not in the ER, right? We're not the emergency room. We're in human resources largely. And most of what we do is not an emergency. The work we do is very important, and we do turn it around as quickly as we can, but it's not, most people don't live or die based on the work that we do. But ironically, even in an emergency room situation, they still triage, right? If you've ever had the misfortune of having to go to an emergency room, the cases get triaged as they come in, and they still prioritize what matters. The patient who is gushing blood from a head wound that is open and bleeding onto the floor is going to get more attention than someone who is quietly complaining of a sore throat.
Yeah, even if the sore throat person is all the way up at the counter, if the head wound guy comes in while they're in the middle of that, the person behind the counter is probably going to say 1 second, and they're going to go deal with that problem.
We prioritize what matters.
Yeah. So you have to use the evidence that you have. Like if you're feeling those symptoms that we talked about earlier because you're trying to get these two or three things done back to back, just look at it and go, well, hold on a second. Do I absolutely have to have these things done today? And then you can look at your deadlines and you can say, okay, well, no, I don't have to do that today. So I don't need to worry about that. I still need to get this work done in a timely manner. But if it takes a little bit longer than anticipated, I'm not beating myself up or trying to rush it in any way.
Yep. This makes really good sense. So I'll pause for a second for our listeners. If you have just joined in, we are here with Benen Witkop, and we're talking about 5 methods to prevent burnout. If you've missed most of this, or you zoned off because you were driving somewhere and you were paying attention to your directions instead of to the main points here, we're talking about recognizing the symptoms and learning to refuel and recharge and considering what's important to do right now. And we're on to number 4 here. Don't be afraid to ask for help. So let's talk about that one. Let's talk about that one a little bit.
Yes. So the most important thing to remember is I would say probably about 90% of the time, in my experience as a writer, might be different in other professions, but this is my personal experience. We don't have to do everything ourselves. And specifically talking about a business writer. As a creative writer, I typically am more of a one-man show for the actual writing. But then, even when I get to the point where I need to start finding an agent and a publisher, then I have an editor, I have an agent, I've got a publisher that I'm talking to, and then it's not a one horse show. But the point that I'm just trying to make is that most of the time you're going to be working in a team, because while you're writing it, you might have somebody editing it. You might have a copy editor who's going to do something with it. You might have the person who actually has to put it on the website and send it out. And there's all these things that kind of go into it. And, even in that sphere of things, there might even just be another writer who works alongside you who's technically handling different projects, but they have a similar job to you and they can help you. And the way that I think about it is that, when we create something, we tend to monopolize it and think about, this is my work. I don't want anybody else to do anything with it because they're not going to do the job that I think I would do with it. Or if you look at it another way, it might be because you promised to get it done and you're looking at it and you're realizing, oh no, I don't think I can get this done. But then you are worried that if you go and tell the person who you said, I'm going to do this, I can't do this, you're going to end up feeling like you disappointed them, and they will not entrust you with these things in the future, even though ordinarily you might have been able to do it. But it's just, going back to prioritizing, you just realized, well, I have to focus on this other thing first because this thing is due much more quickly than this other thing that I promised to do. And when it comes to monopolizing our work, if it's not even our intellectual property, if you're not thinking about it in that sense, it kind of becomes a question of, well, what is our work? What isn't our work? How far does my reach and does my influence stretch? And if you're thinking about that, if you're thinking about what part of this matters to you, you're not thinking about actually getting it done. And that can be kind of a problem because in creative writing, yes, it absolutely matters that this is your work and it's your thing. And even if you have a co-writer, it's yours and that co-writer's thing, and you're working together to create this project. But when it's not necessarily your work, that doesn't matter so much.
Mm.
And more to the point, delegation, taking work and passing it to somebody else and asking for their help, it can, keep a team engaged. It can make your peers, or if you're a manager, it can make the people on your team, if you're a team leader, it can make them feel like, oh, they trust me to handle this work that was theirs. And it can kind of build this sense of closeness and camaraderie. And, now to be fair, you have to be very careful with this because you can't just look at this big stack of papers in front of you, take all of them and divide, cut it into thirds, and then hand those thirds to three people and leave your desk completely clear, because that's not delegation, that's tyranny. And you have to be willing to, get down in the trenches and handle the work right alongside these people. And that's, like I mentioned, that's a great leadership strategy, but it helps you as just another cog in the machine as a worker, making sure that your work is getting done on time, because one person is handling one piece, you're handling another piece, another person's handling another piece. And then when you're all done, you got it done 3 times as quickly because you didn't have to do the first piece and then the second piece and then the third piece. The second and third pieces got done at the same time as the first piece. And prioritizing can help with this, because if you know that perhaps one person has another project that they're doing, you can give the least important piece of this to them and say, when you're done with that thing, please handle this. And maybe you'll finish your work first, and then you can take it back from them and say, you don't got to worry about this, focus on what you're doing. And it kind of all stacks on top of each other to the point where you don't have to worry about work not getting done, because if you trust your team to get work done on time, then just make sure that they have the time to do it, and you really won't have a problem. Trying to do everything is both a crushing workload and a crushing sense of responsibility. If you think you have to do everything, I think of, being the mythological nerd that I am, I think of the analogy of, Atlas in the sky. Atlas is punished by holding the entire weight of the world on his back.
Yep.
And he literally can't move. He's crushed in place.
Yep. And there's no need for that.
Yeah.
So let's get to number 5 then, as we talk about 5 methods we can use to prevent burnout before it gets there. So what's the 5th one?
The last one, you have to remember, this is kind of the peak of the pyramid, and it's the most important thing. And you can't do the last step if you don't think about this step. You have to remember, take care of yourself and others. I already mentioned this kind of. If somebody else has other work, maybe you can say, hey, can you take care of this after you're done? But if you're going to give them some work and then you look at their workload and you realize, oh, they're booked up, they don't have the time to handle this work, and then you give it to them anyway, you might not burn out, but they're certainly probably going to. And then you have the same problem as before, because even if you're not the one who burned out, that person that you just handed that work off to is no less important than you. And the same problem is going to arise because now they're not working as intended, and the machine is seizing up because not every piece is functioning the way that it needs to. And, conversely, like I said, you also have to take care of yourself. If somebody comes to you with a task and says, hey, can you do this for me? And you look at your workload and you try to see, can I fit this in? And you find no breaks that you could possibly do it. Say no. It's okay. Just be honest and say, I've got a full plate. There's no way I can do this. You don't have to feel bad about that, because they are handing it to you for the same reason that you're saying, no, I can't be handed this. So they'll understand. And, that's easy to say as a person who already struggles with saying no to people. It's very easy to say no. But if they're a peer that you trust and you're open and communicate with, they're not going to, scoff in your face and make you take it anyway, or feel like you've scorned them in some way. They'll understand if you're open and honest and say, I'm sorry, I just don't have the capacity to do this because I'm already dealing with X, Y, and Z. I can't take A and B. They'll say, okay. And then they will probably take that work and they'll go to somebody who can handle it. And and it's not to say you can't support them in some way. If you want, go bring them some water later when you're taking one of your breaks. Go bring them a little snack. Go give them a break. Go indulge them in a little conversation, some little tete-a-tete, and do all of these things, within like the scope of what's acceptable for the workplace. And that can help brighten their day and give them that little break that they need and help them to make sure that they don't end up burning out the same way that you're trying to prevent yourself from burning out. Openly communicating is really the name of the game in this one. If you're very open and very honest with one another, then nobody ever has to be worried that they're not telling somebody what needs to be done, that they're not being told something that needs to be done, that somebody might be burning out where you can't see them. If everybody is fully open and honest with what they're doing, then you're able to take care of yourself and others because you know what everybody needs. And then you can look at these things like adjusting the work that you give them or they is given to you, and then you can adjust your stuff to match it. The timing. If you normally do writing in the morning and contact management, if you're an account coordinator, in the evening, but suddenly you have a lot more account management tasks to do over writing, then you move that to the morning so that you have more time in the day to deal with that. And then you can do the writing afterwards. If you have your tools that need to be changed, you can deal with them where you have the tools for one task in one place and the tools for another task in another place. And you can just switch them.
I was going to stop you there because I was going to ask you actually to share maybe some specific examples, because these are, as you're starting to cite some of these aren't just like things a person could do. These are things that you have experience doing when you think about taking care of yourself and others, and how you've done this to prevent burnout. As I think about the year that we've had to work together here, I've watched you, Benen. I've watched you in examples adjust and communicate effectively and openly. Communicate about, hey, based on this particular need or this particular bulk of work that's happening now, or this particular demand on our schedule now, I'm going to adjust these tasks to this time of day, or these tasks to this part of the schedule, or I'm going to adjust these tools to meet this particular working style. Can you share any more about some of the specific, like any stories that you could share that you'd be willing to share with this group about how that specifically worked for you and how it's part of taking care of yourself and others to prevent burnout?
Sure. There's a couple of examples that come to mind. A lot of I made changes to my working styles for a variety of reasons, but there were a couple of them that I can specifically cite for burnout. And the biggest one is I have been working remotely and I live in a different time zone than your clear next step. So I'm an hour ahead of everybody. So when I initially started working, while you guys out in Iowa were working from 9 to 5-ish, I was working in my time zone from 10 to 6. And that ended up being a pretty big problem for me because by the end of the day, 6 o'clock is pretty late. So by the end of the day, no matter what I did, I started feeling incredibly tired. And my attention was like starting to wander because, I can smell somebody cooking dinner elsewhere in my house, or people are getting home from their jobs and I'm, need to go out of my room and double check with them on things that just are happening in the house. And then I have to remember, oh, I can't do this right now. I'm still on the clock for another 30 minutes. So that became a pretty big problem for me. So I adjusted my schedule. I moved it up and I started working from 9 to 5, which was an hour ahead of everyone. So it did have a few consequences because I would get off an hour before everybody else. And that did cause a few problems, but we worked through it in the internal team to make sure that if somebody had something for me after a certain time, they would generally say, hey, when you get on in the morning, can you handle this so we can take care of it first thing in the morning? And that worked rather well. The other way that this went for me when it comes to dealing with burnout is I was spending probably 60% of my waking day sitting at my desk in my room, just doing work. And then when I stopped doing work, I use that same machine to go do the other things that I like, play video games with my friends, or watch some funny videos on YouTube or something along those lines. And streaming services are all over the place now. So if like a show was coming out that I wanted to watch, I typically would end up watching it on my computer as well. So I was spending so much time at my desk that I realized that I was kind of slipping up in certain places at work. So I took it to different mediums where I started keeping a checklist for business proposals rather than just having it on the screen in front of me on my computer. I took it and literally into my own hands, where I had an iPad where I could just physically make check marks so that I was doing that. And I didn't have to sit right in front of my computer when that was happening. I could move across the room and sit on my bed, or go outside, take a laptop with me and go do it somewhere else. And so I started doing these little things that just made it so that I wouldn't be stagnant and sitting in one place. Because that's another thing that kind of goes into burnout, is if you typically end up feeling like you're stuck. And that's what causes those feelings of stress and frustration and all of those things. And it really worked for me.
Great examples. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those, Benen. So this would not be the Even Better podcast if I didn't ask you my trademark question. What's making you even better these days?
Currently, that would be my own internal process improvement. I've noticed a lot of patterns in the mistakes that I've made recently. And, while mistakes are natural, I made some of them repeatedly in a number of ways. And I noticed, my own carelessness. I wasn't taking the steps that I needed to correct those little errors that I was making, and they were starting to build up on one another in a variety of ways. And, there's reasons why that happened. I suffer from ADHD, I suffer from anxiety. And while those are reasons that these things might happen, like I mentioned, I was taking steps to try to correct these things. And even when that was happening, it really wasn't doing enough. And, I try to live by the motto, a mistake is only a failure if we don't learn from it. And while I thought I was doing that, I wasn't doing it well enough. So now I'm just trying to take some time and look inward and figuring out what I need to do for myself to make sure that I can get my work done adequately, even without taking into account these things about burnout. And I take, notes, reminders, start strategically organizing tabs in workspaces. And I just do all of these things so that, really rolling back into that idea of stagnation, I never get complacent. And I try to make sure that things are dynamic, because that's one of the first things that I've noticed about my own internal process improvement, is that I work very well in a dynamic environment.
Nice. I love it. Well, Benen, I thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. I appreciate you. If our listeners wanted to follow up with you, of course, they can reach out to us and we'll get them in touch with you. But otherwise, can they find you on LinkedIn or anywhere else out there?
Yes, the most reliable way to get in contact with me at this time would probably be my LinkedIn profile. And as long as you spell my name right, you can probably find me pretty easily. And that should be somewhere in the description of this podcast. So
fair enough. We'll send them to LinkedIn, or if they can't find you from that, they can connect with us and we'll get them connected with you.
yep, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to be able to discuss these things, because this is really something that I connect with on a very personal level. I've burned out so many times doing so many things. So, and I wish I knew these strategies before I really started getting into my creative writing, because they probably would have saved me from a couple of real bad experiences when I was younger. And I hope that this helps somebody out there to recognize that, oh, I'm headed towards my first burnout. Let me stop and take a look at what I can do.
Bet. Thank you. Well, and to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope on behalf of all of us here at Your Clear Next Step, we hope the rest of your day is even better.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.